is Stanford, and today I'm going to give you an overview of American Sign Language's language, community, and culture. So first I want to start off with the term sign language. It's really just a generic name for the many different kinds of modes of communication that use sign language. There are 6 or 7 different kinds of sign language that you can use, and each deaf individual is different as to what kind they prefer to use. The first method that I'm going to talk about is the Rochester Method. The Rochester Method is a method where all you do is you simply finger spell every word. There are no signs to actually add to that language. It is simply that every single word is finger spelled with each letter to compose that entire word the entire time. So the next method that I want to talk about, because that one's very different, these next methods really involve a type of sign that go with them. The first one I want to talk about is Seeing Essential English, also known as C1. And that really focuses on the syllables of the English language, and it follows very closely, if not exactly, to the English word order that we would read and see in our first language, since our first language is English. C2, which is Signing Exact English, that also focuses on each word in the English language, and it pairs it with a sign, but it also includes things such as the beginnings or the endings and those different grammatical words that form our English language. So if there's an ing at the end of the word, if there's one of those small classifiers like a, the, to be helping verbs such as is and am, those kinds of things all help to make up when you're signing C2. Those are both C1 and C2 are very English-based. And sometimes that can be very helpful when learning to read, learning to write, and understanding what those words mean and the word order in which we use them. Then you have your signed English, which starts to add in some more of those ASL signs, but still keeping it in the grammatical order of English. Concept sign, or pigeon sign English as you could also call it, kind of mixes the structures of ASL and English when using it. And then there is CASE, which is Conceptually Accurate Sign English. And that combines the English grammar order with the conceptually accurate ASL signs. Okay? Both SE, signed English, or not both, but all three really, signed English, concept sign, or PSE, as it was formerly called, and CASE, conceptually accurate signed English. All three of these are kind of a mixture of both English and ASL. They tend to stay maybe more in the English word order, but they do incorporate some of those ASL signs. They also might initialize a sign, which would be to put a letter with that, whether it be an R or an L, different things like that. So they're going to incorporate some of those more English ways into some ASL grammar signs. Lastly, then you have American Sign Language, which is what you guys are currently learning right now. American Sign Language is completely different. It really is. It's a natural language with its own structure, completely separate from the English language itself. In fact, it was developed by deaf people. It was not even developed by someone who was hearing and already knew English. Okay, so it is not derived in any way from the English language, which is why it has its own grammatical system and structure. That's also the reason why we can offer that as a foreign language, because it does have the differences that, you know, Spanish or French or German or Chinese, that all these other languages, they are different from the English language, just as ASL, with its own structure, is different from the English language. ASL is also the national language of the deaf community. So it's really something that those who are deaf and hard of hearing that are involved in the deaf community, it tends to become their first language, their primary language that they use to communicate with those around them who are also deaf or hard of hearing. I want to show you an example of some of the differences so you can get a feel for what that looks like when it's signed and how is it really that different from C1 or C2 to something like concept sign or case and ASL. So I'm going to use the sentence that I'm going to write on the board. I went to the store with my mom. I'm going to write that. So the first language that I'm going to use is C2, which is signed exact English. And remember, that looks at signing every word and including some of those endings and such. And it sometimes will use an initialized sign here or there, but it is more English-based, okay? So before I sign this, for those of you that do not know all of the signs, I know you have a small foundation of sign, but I want to teach you some that you may not know within this sentence. So go, the word go, you start from one side and you go out to the other, right? If you've done something already or it's happened in the past, you can either use finished or you can say in the past. Anything here behind you means in the past, okay? Also, the word store. Then you have the word with. And then you also can show that two people are doing something by using your fingers to represent people. Two people are doing something, they're walking or they're going somewhere. You can also, when you're talking about two people, say, using your finger, that this is pointing to that person over there, and this one's pointing to me, so the two of us are doing it. And I just want you to be aware, because I will be using those when I show you some of these signs. Okay? So, starting with C2, which is going to go in exactly the same order that it is written on the board, is going to say, so it signs every single word. I went, in the past, meaning it's finished, to the store with my mom. Okay? Follows every single word in the exact same English order. Now, case. Because case is kind of that mix in between English word order or the way in which we typically speak and ASL, which is more of that visual gestural language, it combines a little bit of both and it would look like this. Okay, so I'll sign that again. I went, that's finished, so that shows it's in the past. Store, there's the store, with my mom. And here's the both of us going to the store. Okay, so with C2, it signed every single word. With case, we signed I went and we signed to the store with my mom. And there was a little bit more to that because we showed the store, the place where it was, and then we did show both of us going there. But unlike C2, it didn't sign every single word, okay? It just signed a few of them. Now, American Sign Language is different. American Sign Language is going to set up this sentence this way. Okay, so the way that this one is being set up, it's telling us, oh, Mom, setting up, who's going, right? Mom. Then it shows the both of us. So that means both Mom and I are going to the store. We have the store. There it is. The both of us are going. We show that it's finished because it's happened already in the past. All right, so really, it signs Mom, but that came at the beginning, and because of the gesturing of the both of us, that takes care of saying that I went as well, right? Because it's talking about the both of us. Then it also signed where they went. So they set up, oh, that's the place, that's the store, there it is over there. And then you see them walking there, right? So that takes care of saying that you went to that place. And to show that it's in the past, that you're not currently going to it, or that you're not going to in the future go to the store, you would add at the end that you are finished, right? That happened in the past, right? That just kind of gives you an example of some of the differences between C2, which uses every single word. So if I were to check up here, it would be every single word that is signed. Versus case, conceptually accurate sign English versus American Sign Language. Okay? All right, so when we start to learn about this and start to read things about American Sign Language and who uses American Sign Language, we're going to read about deaf people who use American Sign Language. And sometimes you will see that that word, deaf, uses a capital D, or it might use a lowercase d. Okay? And that means two different things. So I'm going to highlight some of the differences between a capital D and a lowercase d, deaf. All right, so we have our capital D, deaf. On the other side, we have our lowercase d, deaf. All right, so maybe when you think about people who are deaf, you would think initially, oh, they can't hear, or they have some kind of hearing loss. And they may wear hearing aids, they may wear a cochlear implant, or they may not wear any devices at all, but you know that they cannot hear as typically as a hearing person would. So when we regard hearing loss with lowercase d, deaf people, we think of it just in medical terms. So you have a hearing loss that you refer to in medical terms. Okay? Then, because maybe someone who is lowercase d deaf only really refers to their hearing loss in a medical term, it would mean that they typically would identify themselves with mostly hearing people. So the majority of who they hang out with, who they socialize with, and who they relate to, their identity really is geared more towards those that are hearing. Maybe they have hearing aids and they feel, I get enough help with my hearing aids that I'm just like you. I'm more of a hearing person. So I hang out with the mostly just hearing people, and that is totally fine. Every deaf individual has the choice to identify themselves as lowercase d deaf or capital D deaf, but I want you to know the differences and how someone would identify themselves and what that might mean. So, they identify more with hearing people. Okay? That's not to say that they don't have a friend who might be deaf or hard of hearing, and that's not even to say that they don't sign and that they only speak. Okay? You can be lowercase d deaf and use sign language as your primary mode of communication, or use speaking or voicing as your primary mode of communication. Okay? You can also have some friends who might be deaf or hard of hearing, but the majority of who you associate with really would be hearing. Okay? Because you would feel that the identity as a lowercase d deaf individual would associate more with those hearing people. Okay? There's also a whole community of people who are capital D deaf. They all make up this wonderful community. And when you identify yourselves as a lowercase d deaf, you tend to not associate with that deaf community. Like I said, every individual is different, but these are the biggest differences that most people who would consider themselves lowercase d deaf would fit underneath these type of things. So not a part of the deaf community. Okay? So then, when we look at capital D deaf, what does that mean in comparison? Well, since they regard their hearing loss in medical terms, those who are capital D deaf have a strong pride and identity in being deaf. They don't feel that there's anything wrong, that deafness is just a part of who they are. It's not something wrong with them, okay? And that's important to know, because some people could view deafness as, oh, I'm so sorry that you're deaf. But these people who are capital D deaf, they're proud. They know they're deaf. That's just a part of who they are. That's like having blue eyes or brown hair. They're deaf. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with it in their eyes. So they have that sense of a strong deaf identity. In the same way that someone who's lowercase d deaf relates to hearing people or the hearing world, capital D deaf associates more with the deaf community. They probably have more friends who are deaf, and they have the same communication modes, or at least maybe similar communication modes, that allows them to talk freely and hang out and socialize very easily, rather than some of the challenges that someone can face if they sign and someone is hearing, where you're trying to read lips, or the hearing person might know a little bit of sign. There's that communication breakdown. So they tend to associate more with other people who are also deaf, who might be involved in the deaf community as well. So they have a strong association with other deaf people. And then lastly, as we said that they're not a part of the deaf community, if you are capital D deaf, you have a strong sense of pride for your community, your deaf community, because that is very special to you. You share some of those common goals and beliefs, and some of those common experiences as well. So they have a strong sense of pride in their community. to make some generalizations. Generally, if someone is lowercase d deaf, they may have been mainstreamed, okay? And that means that that deaf individual or that hard of hearing individual went to their public school within their school district or within their county, and that school had a majority of hearing people that went to that school, but they happen to have a hearing loss. They happen to be deaf or hard of hearing, maybe use sign, maybe speak, I'm not sure, but either way, they are like the only person or one of a few people that go to a mainstream school, right? The majority of everyone there is hearing. And on the opposite end, when we have capital D deaf, that sense of pride, that strong deaf identity, a lot of times those individuals will go to a school for the deaf, okay? And that school, every state, or just about every state has one. So in Ohio, which is where I live, they have the Ohio School for the Deaf. And there may be some other ones. We have one closer to Cincinnati called St. Rita's School for the Deaf. And those are different opportunities where those individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing can go to that school with all these other kids who are deaf and hard of hearing just like them, and they can go to school there. Now, sometimes that might mean that they're spending time away from their parents because their parents have sent them there, because there may only be one in the entire state. So it may seem like you are sending them off to a boarding school where they would actually have a dorm and they would stay and they would hang out with those who also stayed and lived in those dorms, and they did community events together, they went to school together. Or sometimes you might have a family who decides to pick up and move closer to where that school is offered, and that way the student can then commute back and forth, whether it's the parents driving and dropping them off, or once they get older and they have their license, that they're driving to that school, just like some of the hearing kids maybe in your community might do at their public school. Okay? And typically, they do go to a school for the deaf. Now, that's not to say that every kid that goes to a school for the deaf considers themselves capital D deaf with that strong sense of pride and identity, and that every kid that goes to a mainstream school will always and forever be a lowercase d deaf and want to hang out with those that are hearing. It could be that a student started out being lowercase d deaf, identifying themselves more with the hearing communication, and through growing up and finding out more about who they are and what it means to be deaf, and making friends possibly with other deaf people, they could then decide to change from having a majority of hearing kids or hearing friends to having maybe a majority of deaf friends, or becoming more involved within the deaf community and all the events that they offer. And then they may change their personal identity and consider themselves as capital D deaf. Every single person who is deaf and hard of hearing needs to make their own choice as to how they identify themselves and what they relate best to. When you are seeing these two words in writing, when you're reading textbooks about it, then typically when you have capital D deaf, they are referring to the culture, deaf culture, okay? And lowercase d deaf typically refers to the hearing loss. Now, sometimes there might be a hearing person who knows American Sign Language and spends a lot of time within the deaf community and feels very connected, but that hearing person cannot call themselves or identify themselves as capital D deaf. They are still just a hearing person, okay? But they can be accepted into the deaf community, and they can still be very involved in the community events, and that is perfectly fine. Which kind of segues us into talking about the deaf community. Now, the deaf community is a separate cultural group that has its own values, and they share common experiences. If you do consider yourself a member of the deaf community, then that means that you are accepting and supporting the values and the goals of that community, of your deafness. And typically ASL, or not typically, it is, ASL, American Sign Language, is the national language of the deaf community. Okay? Now, not every deaf person is a part of the deaf community, as we kind of found out when talking about how one identifies themselves and connects to maybe hearing people versus deaf people. But it is there, and the really cool thing about it is that they have a lot more in common than just American Sign Language. They have a history that goes back generations, about a history about their culture and about how their language was developed. They have a system of beliefs and patterns of behavior. They have common shared experiences, and part of those experiences are that they live in this hearing society. And so it's really neat to have this instant connection, and that is probably one of the coolest things, in my opinion, about the deaf community. You could be living here in Ohio and travel anywhere throughout the United States, and if you see another deaf person, it's like you have an instant best friend, because you have that common shared experience and values and beliefs and historical background, that you instantly have something in common with that person. Just like if you were to meet somebody who was a stranger who loved football as much as you did, or who loved drawing as much as you did, and instantly you guys can start chatting about this. Now, I feel that that instant bond within the deaf community is stronger than possibly those examples, but it is just something that is really, really neat to know, that you are instantly accepted into the deaf community when you travel throughout and you see others who are deaf or hard of hearing that are also a part of that deaf community. Now, all of these local deaf communities together, they all make up this large national deaf community throughout the United States. And all of the regional variations and, class rank and race and ethnicity and religion, they are all such an integral part of the culture. They all contribute to the community and the culture and how we think of deaf culture and what we learn about deaf culture in the United States today. It is the culture of deaf people from which American Sign Language is generated and has preserved and passed on its language from generation to generation. The deaf community is a large community of American Sign Language users, which is very indicative of the power of a strong and vibrant culture of deaf people, persisting and thriving throughout many past generations, all the way to present day. So to be informed about and to learn about this language of American Sign Language and the background that comes with it, the history of how it was derived from deaf people themselves and passed on to generation, that it's evolved this community of people that have a common shared belief system and values and goals, is really quite incredible, that they have this in common, just as we have in common as hearing. Since I am hearing, as a hearing person, that I have all of that kind of historical background information. And really, this deaf community can be very powerful. And we'll talk later about some of the things that when they band together, they can accomplish things and get things done for their deaf community because they can unite themselves so powerfully. All right, that's it for today. If you have any more questions, please feel free to ask your ASL teacher, and he or she would be able to expand more on the deaf language and community and culture of that. But I appreciate you guys watching. Thanks. See you later.